As part of the installation of iSales 100, users will have a new module in the Sage 100 system that's labeled xkzero Web Services. In xkzero Web Services, the primary function that you'll do there will be setting up the remote users in remote user maintenance. I'm going to use an example here to illustrate some of the setup options that we have. Part of the power of iSales 100 is that you're able to manage all of this data right within Sage 100. And each individual user you're able to set up with a very unique set of rules and preferences to make the best experience possible for them. So in this case here, I set up a remote user called JK, and I've applied a password for them, and I've mapped each user to a company code and a salesperson code. So if an individual needs to access two different companies in iSales 100, that individual will need two separate remote user IDs in order to do that mapping. Okay, so other things that are done on the first tab include setting up whether or not a user is required to synchronize their data day in and day out. So if you need a very common setting would be to set this to the number 1, which would mean that that user would be required to synchronize their data at least once a day. If this user, for whatever reason, needs to be disabled, for instance, if they've left the company, all you have to do is come back, check the user disabled box, and then click on accept, and then that user will no longer be able to access iSales 100. So a couple other important things to note here. You have control for each individual user about whether or not you can display pricing or not, whether or not they have access to seeing warehouse quantities in inventory, whether or not you allow for a price lookup for an inventory item, whether or not you display costs for inventory items for that particular user. On the Customers tab, we have a number of important setups that are done here. So this is where we can apply filters for which customers that salesperson has access to. So, and if you'll recall, when we set up JK, we mapped that remote user to a salesperson code within Sage 100, and you can use these checkboxes to indicate, simply to limit the assignment of customers based on that salesperson assignment, including the assignment of a salesperson code at the ship to level. We have additional options to include or exclude customers who are internet customers, credit hold customers, or temporary customers, all as designated within the customer master file in Sage 100. In addition, when it comes to filtering customers, you can apply multiple logic based on any data field within the customer master file for including or excluding customers assigned to that remote user. Including in that are any user-defined fields that have been set up at the customer level. So you can establish one or more criteria to add to your selection logic for customers. Additionally, on the sync options, there are options for whether or not you want to include the customer memos as a pop-up in iSales 100, whether or not you want to have the customer last purchase history for orders, quotes, invoices. This will follow all of the customer last purchase history rules that you have set up in the sales order module. In addition to that, however, you may choose to restrict that customer last purchase history by number of months by entering a value in this place right here. Okay. And then for each customers, you can give permission to either add a new customer or a new contact for customers on the fly. And if you're able, if that user is able to add new customers on the fly, then you can assign a default tax schedule, as well as a default terms code, a default customer price level, and then, as I mentioned, you can also indicate if you can add a new contact or not. And then lastly, on the customer tab, you can add up to 8 additional fields for display at the customer master level within the application by choosing those fields here in the additional fields panel. Over on the items panel, this is where you're going to restrict which inventory item types will be brought down to the application, be them regular items, miscellaneous charge codes, comment codes, or miscellaneous items. These all refer back to codes that are set up in common information in Sage 100. In addition, you can indicate whether you wish to have finished goods, kits, raw materials, or include discontinued items in the inventory that's brought down to iSales 100. You can choose to exclude at the time that you synchronize data, whether or not you want to have 0 on hand or 0 available information. In this section here, the alias items, customer alias, and vendor alias, this refers to if you're doing barcode scanning for adding new transactions into iSales 100, we will recognize barcode scans for individual item numbers as well as the alias item numbers subject to your selection here. The button here for hide the category information. So at the item master level in iSales 100, we display all 4 standard category fields from the item master file. You can elect to hide those fields if that's not relevant to your business. And then I'll check this box for kits here. This box right here provides the ability for you to be able to view sales kit details when you're adding a new transaction. The filter by warehouse allows you to choose 1 or more warehouses to be displayed for that user in iSales 100. So you can choose those accordingly. And then on the additional fields, this is similar to the item master file or the customer master file, where if you wish to display additional item information in the item master, including user-defined fields, you can choose up to 8 additional fields from the inventory item data dictionary to add for that display. On the Open Orders tab, you can indicate what type of open orders you wish to display in iSales 100. Standard orders, back orders, price quotes, master orders, repeating orders, all of the load types within Sage 100, and then the order status, new, open, or hold. And then these options here for printing have to do with whether or not that user would have the ability, if you're doing mobile printing, to reprint open orders or back orders or price quotes if you're doing price quotes as well. And then very similar options on the open invoice side of things. This includes checkboxes for whether or not you wish to see credit memos, debit memos, payments, finance charges, cash transactions, or an invoice balance forward. Again, following all of the definitions in Sage 100. This option right here is whether or not you wish to bring down the detail for all of those open invoices in Sage 100, and then whether or not you wish to allow reprinting of invoices or credit memos from the field. And then lastly, on the New Transactions tab, in the first section up above, these are the 4 different transaction types in sales orders. So orders, quotes, invoices, credit memos. So each user just check accordingly the transaction types you wish for them to have. The default transaction type will help speed up data entry by choosing the most frequently used transaction type for them. And then we have boxes for whether or not you'll allow a transaction to take place if that user exceeds the credit hold. And then additionally, if you wish to have new orders automatically be placed on hold when you synchronize orders from the field, go ahead and check that box for that. The default warehouse code, this will act as a default warehouse code for that individual user when they create new transactions. The questions for signature on a transaction, you can require that, make it optional, or have no signature for a a user in terms of getting a signature from a new transaction. The enabling the live transaction has to do with sales tax calculation. Again, you can say not required, required, or optional in terms of doing that sales tax calculation from the field. And then additional controls that you have during the course of a transaction entry. Whether or not you wish to have the unit price calculated when you synchronize the transaction and push it back into Sage 100, you would check that box. Whether or not the user has the ability to override fields, bill to address, ship via terms code, total discount, the ability to create a new transaction memo in sales order or not, recalculating unmodified prices during the synchronization, the ability to override a unit price, a price level, the unit of measure, or a line level discount. And then additional options here. I don't have that license to this version here with the lot and serial numbers, but these checkboxes here have to do with whether or not you require allocation of lot and serial numbers on the different transaction types. And then the last option that we have is whether or not you allow the override of salespeople. So remember, when we set up Jim Kentley, we said that Jim Kentley is the primary salesperson, but by making additional selections here, what we're saying is that when Jim Kentley, when this user JK creates an order, he may assign credit for those orders to additional individuals, and so those would be selected there. So that's a basic overview of the back-end setup of remote user maintenance in order to create a unique experience for each individual user of iSales 100. If you have any questions, please contact us at 847-416-2009 or info@xkzero.com. Thank you.